So the Biltmore Corridor is actually two roads, Biltmore, McDowell, about 2 miles long, going from downtown Asheville down towards the interstate to the south. There are 20,000-ish arterials, old 4-lane. We'll get into some of the major generators they serve. There's a lot of terrain here, very narrow corridors, not a lot of width for expansion, but there's a lot of redevelopment happening here. So some of the questions we were asked to look at was how to deal with that growing congestion and ideally make walking and biking more comfortable and safe, increase those mode shares, promote transit and some alternative modes. And one of the things that even came up, and we'll get into this a little bit, is the idea of an imbalance pair with going from 4 lanes to 3 lanes. But as you can see, they're 2-1 combinations, and that actually gets kind of interesting. And StreetLight had a lot to do with that, the data we got. So we've got 6 major zones. There's a major medical center. I'll get into these a little bit more. A large community college, a major high school, and 3 big retail entertainment districts. The downtown, which technically is outside of our corridor study area, but it has such a big impact on it, we decided to include it. We've also got Biltmore Estate, biggest employer in the county, one of the biggest tourist attractions in the state. Biltmore Village, AB Tech, high school, medical center, and then over here is a minor league baseball and a minor league stadium also used for soccer and football. Then there's a lot of neighborhood access through here. So we set up, and just based on budget and things, we just got the basic 50 zone subscription, looking only at traffic because right now there isn't a lot of bike, ped, and transit in here. Set up 6 non-pass-through zones that are our kind of activity centers. We've got 26 pass-through gates, set up 7 filters, and we used, there are 11 NCDOT ongoing count stations here. So we've got good coverage, and we use those to do our single factor calibrated index. Because this project started before COVID, we had planned to do some intersection turning movement counts. Weren't able to do that, so we've reserved 16 to pick up some turning movement counts, and we've got 2 more to play with if we need them. We did a lot of different applications on this, pretty much everything we could on this study. Big part was the trip origin destination patterns, what we like to call travel markets. We looked at the through trips using OD with middle filters. We looked at internal external trips to the home and work grids using zone analysis. Some really interesting time of day, day of week, and monthly variations because of the tourist recreation traffic here. We looked and got some really interesting things based on trip distance, length, and speed from zonal analysis. You'll see we didn't find much of use in terms of the demographics of the travelers. I think the block group was just a little too big here. We know there are differences, but we'd have to get down to block or even parcel group. So we feel we have to do that more manually, some little different techniques. An important part was also the route choice and assessing impacts if we make some changes. And that was OD and with middle filters. We are going to look a little bit at the COVID-19 impacts using AADT analysis and the turning movements for OD. So this is all 2019 pre-COVID. We didn't try because we didn't have the enough zones to really make the corridor airtight, and get every in and out. So it's not sealed. We looked just at the major routes, and I think that's appropriate for this study. But we're confident we got over 90%, 95% of the traffic, and we're more interested in the relative movements rather than absolute values. So these again are the major zones we saw downtown, and the vehicle trips we identified using the zonal analysis. The South Slope is a developing entertainment district south of downtown. We've got the hospital, we've got the high school, AB Tech, and Biltmore Village. So it kind of represents the trip generators in this corridor. We used the home grids to try to identify, where trips were coming from. That was actually pretty useful. Here's one for Biltmore Village, which is right there. We can see there's some close-in, and not huge numbers, but there are some close-in trip generators and kind of this north-south corridor that shows up. And this is kind of similar to what we saw for South Slope and downtown, similar pattern. What's interesting, though, is to look at Mission Hospital, much broader, more dispersed regional capture. And the AB Tech is very similar. The high school was a very different one that we looked at. But what really helped was then when we combined all of these, looking at all 6 of these generators, layered them on top of each other, and we can really start to see this, several things, this north-south corridor, especially to the north, a lot of close-in trips, and the beginning of a corridor out to the west, West Asheville, which is starting to redevelop and becoming a hot spot. Just coincidentally, we had been finishing up another study for NCDOT using StreetLight, and we looked at 5 major metropolitan areas in the state, and we were trying to identify potential commuter transit markets. So we happened to identify the same set of employment centers, trip attractors, in the southern part of the corridor, the Medical Center, High School, Community College, Biltmore Village. There were actually 6 others of these. The downtown was one, and down here at the airport was another one. And we used block groups and just kind of identified this heat map of where the trips to this employment center were coming from. Overlaid on top of that, the current transit network in pink and white, that designates the frequency of service. And then we also did some analysis looking at traffic along these roads, looking at congestion and things like that. So this also tended to confirm this north-south corridor in this area. And from this, we had made some pretty high-level improvements to transit service that seem to be supported as we get into the detail of the current study we're doing. So what this is kind of telling us is it does seem to be a case for a higher frequency of service, emphasize some particular transit corridor treatments, looking at some options here in West Asheville. Another thing that got real interesting in this corridor was the time of day. So here we just took a sample, Mission Hospital, and this is absolute trips. See the big 8 a.m. peak for the hospital, not unusual, 1 p.m. peak, and then the 5 p.m. Again, all pre-COVID, but this hasn't changed much. But you can see how different that is from here in the yellow, AB Tech, peaks in the morning and then trickles down. The high school, a much smaller number of trips, but the typical high school peaks. But then you can also see South Slope and Biltmore Village are much more, not a big morning peak, big lunchtime peaks, and evening kind of stretching on. When we stack these on top of each other, we start to see, the contributors from Mission Hospital up to the high school, 9 a.m., which is really about the same we found as the 1 p.m. peak, and then this 4 to 5. So that was helpful looking at the corridor overall, and then trying to look at TDM or other solutions by each one of these major employment centers. Because of the nature of Asheville, we also looked at a weekend, and you can see this is lower volume, but still a pretty good and interesting peak. There's still a lot of hospital trips, but there's a lot more of the South Slope and Biltmore Village. We didn't show downtown on these because it's so much bigger, it kind of swamps these out. What's interesting is this is kind of what the weekday COVID peak looks like. Schools aren't in session. We don't have this big peak. The peaks seem to be, and we're seeing this other places too, the morning peak slides later and later, and then you kind of have this plateau through the afternoon and later in the evening. So we kind of think that's interesting. That tells us some things about transit implications, that maybe this isn't a peak hour service. Maybe it's something really serving this corridor throughout the day. We do have significant weekend demand and some other things that are actually helping support that conclusion. We did an OD analysis between these major employers' activity centers to see what that looked like. Here's one looking, Mission Hospital has a lot of trips headed downtown. These are daily basis, a lot to Biltmore Village. This seems to be going out for lunch is a big part of it. There's also some residential development in both these areas. that could be part of it. We also see, and we'll get more into this, the AB Tech Mission Hospital has a pretty good exchange across one of these busy roads. That's partly because of the educational program, nursing and medical education that has people going over to the hospital, students, but also there's some remote parking over in the AB Tech that the hospital uses. And parking is one of the big factors. Parking is kind of hard to get to, awkward places, hard to walk from, a little bit expensive compared to most North Carolina places. So that also speaks to some options. This is just looking at Biltmore Village. We see, again, a real strong connection between downtown and Biltmore Village. A lot of that is tourist driven. You can see the sites in both, and that kind of repeats that Mission Hospital. So what that kind of told us was looking at a service going down this corridor just with 3 well-placed stops could capture about 5% of the current traffic on this road. Obviously, we wouldn't get all that, but that's a pretty nice market to take a whack at. We also saw a lot of short distance trips between Mission Hospital and AB Tech. Is that a shuttle or some bike ped improvements? Sort of very related to that is trip length. And here we look, you'll see AB Tech and Mission Hospital on the left. They're much more regional in nature, but about 40% of their trips are less than 5 mile. Look, on the other hand, at Biltmore Village, about 60% of their trips are that 2 to 5 mile range or less. And the other South Slope and downtown look similar to that. So that seems to say, a possibility for bicycle and transit. Didn't show it, but also a lot of these trips tended to be very slow. Surprising number were average 10 miles an hour or less. So it really seemed you could be competitive with the automobile, especially with those parking issues. So I kind of summarized that here. One thing I wanted to say, we did look at the demographic differences. We couldn't tease anything out. It was kind of all looked the same, but we know, for example, where this fence is, there's some low-income housing going in. So we're trying to deal with that kind of very directly rather than through this type of approach. Talk a little bit now about drilling down to the kind of route selection idea. And here we just said, let's look at all the trips coming up from the interstate at this point, and which ones go completely through, leave this study area, the yellow area. Initially, they're pretty well split, McDowell and Biltmore, close to 50-50. But we found those, when we add these up, the red, 22% through, that about 50% more through traffic. McDowell has about 50% more north-south through traffic than Biltmore. And we'll see a little bit more about that. Biltmore also, what we found here, there's some real imbalances that people kind of go in one direction and come back in another. And we'll see more and more of that. And that has some significant implications. And I don't know how we would have got a handle on that without this type of analysis. We did another OD analysis looking just at this same traffic. Where does it go in terms of these major zones? So it says again that Biltmore is kind of primary access for the hospital. McDowell is more for the schools, and they kind of go 50-50 for downtown and South Slope. This is one I hesitated to show because it's kind of ugly and it's not the best practice. We call it the kitchen sink. We just threw all the zones in here. And for example, you'll see this one here. Most of the trips on McDowell are going all the way up to Ashland to the north. That's this arrow here. You also see this much smaller share. It's downtown. Well, those are actually double counting. A lot of these trips are going to South and to downtown. But what was interesting is that only makes up about 20%, 25% of this Ashland traffic. The rest of this is going somewhere else, through town or to the west. So that's what we really need to dig out. That surprised a lot of people. The assumption was these folks were mainly going downtown. We know that's not the case now. So that was really valuable, just to see at that point. And here is looking at the other bridge on Biltmore. See a much different distribution with the hospital, downtown, and a lot of east-west along the river here. So they're very, very different. And we also then are looking at each generator. Here's looking just at the hospital, where those trips going in the corridor. about 40% north, much more, almost 60% south, heavily oriented towards Biltmore south. And then when we saw where they left the study area, it's very much going down towards Hendersonville and the interstate, but some other directions here that are all served by Biltmore. And then these are sort of to the north. So that's has a lot to do with where the parking decks are, how the hospital entrances are set up, things like that. And lastly, this is one we wanted to see an example on Meadow Road here. This is looking at eastbound trips on Meadow Road, and here's our corridor. And we see a lot of these end up Swananoa Road, they're over here. Hendersonville Road to the south, coincidentally, Bryson Street on Biltmore Village. When we reverse it and look at this traffic in the other direction, we see some very different patterns. So they're coming and going in different ways, and that's what's we have to be really careful with that. But we think that might make that imbalanced pair a feasible option. So summing everything up, the route analysis, I think this is what we're going to be using now to test our alternatives and come up with the traffic volumes that we'll be plugging into our analysis model or synchro models and things like that. The imbalance pair, we know that McDowell looks a lot less divertible. Maybe that becomes the through traffic route, and the other one becomes Biltmore becomes the local ped bike transit route.